Saving lives during the Aisne Battle of 1944, the story of the work of the Royal Army Medical Corps. Once the British reached the Aisne, the front line stopped moving, but the danger didn't. There were very few quiet days and casualties came in daily, sometimes hundreds from a single division or brigade. On the 14th of September, the 1st Division reported 2,000 to 3,000 killed, wounded and missing, and the 2nd Division over 1,000. Wounds were mainly from shrapnel and machine gun fire, but German heavy artillery began to make itself felt, especially the 8.2-inch howitzer, firing a 200-pound high-explosive shell used against the British for the first time in this fighting. Early trenches were too narrow to provide adequate protection against shrapnel. Some units used caves and cliff shelters along the spurs of the Aisne Valley, better than open ground but not safe. A single hit could be catastrophic. On the 25th of September, a high-explosive shell struck a cave used as the headquarters by the 1st Battalion of the Cameron Highlanders, and it killed the commanding officer, the adjutant, the battalion medical officer, who was a Lieutenant Crockett from the RAMC, and other officers and many men, proof that even shell-proof positions could fail. The Aisne Valley created other problems that dominated medical work, and this was linked to the roads and bridges, and the bridges themselves, because the open valley allowed all of these to be under constant shell fire, so moving casualties across the river in daylight became almost impossible. Evacuation increasingly became a nighttime operation. Now, the good news was sickness was relatively low, but there were warnings. Marshy ground near Missy caused sickness in the 14th Brigade, and in early October there was anxiety about a outbreak of enteric fever in the 2nd Division. Now, even though the situation was better, the medical unit still paid heavily, and between the 12th of September and the 15th of October, RAMC losses include 9 officers killed or died, 7 wounded and 4 missing, and then there was 13 other ranks killed, 40 wounded and 16 missing. Now, the medical system on the Aisne was more organised, but it was still a brutally dangerous job to be doing, and compared to the retreat and pursuit, medical services now had a chance to operate more systematically because the front started to stabilise after the 15th of September. This stability allowed a more structured chain. Advanced dressing stations, ADSs, were pushed as close to the trenches as shelter allowed, often in caves or behind ridges, and sometimes so close they almost merged with the regimental aid posts, or RAPs. Now, main dressing stations, MDSs, were usually placed on the south bank of the Aisne, and this allowed from the south bank wounded could be loaded into supply column lorries and evacuated to railheads. But between the ADS and the MDS was the killer gap. Wounded had to be moved down valleys and along exposed roads, then across bridges under artillery fire, and this was often under direct observation by the enemy. The river line made evacuation a nightly battle against time, shells, congestion and exhausted horses. So looking at the main dressing stations across the front, going from right to left, a chain of semi-permanent MDSs, remember that's main dressing stations, were established. There was the sugar factory east of Villa-au-Peron, and this was being used by the 1st Cavalry Division, and the 1st Infantry Division, who was next to them, basically set up in the same area. The next along was the 2nd Division, the 2nd Division, and they were at an hospital farm near River Aisne. And that's there. Then the next is the 3rd Division, and they were in Marne. Then we jump to the 5th Division, and they were set up in Searches and Mont-de-Soissons farm. Then, slightly out of order, the 4th Division were over on the left, and they were at Carré-l'Évêque farm near Septmoin. This was actually a series of large quarried caves, and these would all be feeding back to the next stage of the casualty clearing chain, which was the number 6 clearing hospital, which was in the Chateau in Rosière, and I'll point that out on a later map. Now, many of these were 4 to 5 miles behind the front, far enough to make it difficult to evacuate casualties, but close enough to be threatened. So if we start to look at some of the divisions in turn, we'll go back to the right hand to the eastern flank, and that was the 1st Cavalry Division. And they were quite lucky, they had a small number of casualties, but they ran advanced dressing stations at a place called Poissy. Now, the problem was this was exposed and heavily shelled, and therefore later had to be withdrawn. And they had another one north of Pargan, which is just sort of down and left of my little circle on the map. Now, these advanced dressing stations didn't only serve the cavalry. They helped the 1st Division units on the British right by collecting casualties from their positions as well. An example of the initiative under fire comes from No. 3 Cavalry Field Ambulance, which was being led by Major West. Now, he was ordered forward to Sapir on the 15th of September and came under heavy fire, pulling back south of the river to Uli overnight, and he still didn't have clear instructions. So he returned and tried again on the 16th of September, and again they were forced back by heavy German fire, but they did manage to collect around 200 wounded from the chateau at Soupir, and this is a pre-war postcard image of that very building. And most of the evacuation was done after dark by wagons and improvised vehicles. They managed to send them across to a main dressing station at Villers the next morning. This pattern, move forward, get shelled, improvise shelter, evacuate at night, was to become quite typical of the fighting on the Aisne. So next to them was the 1st Division, so we've heard some of their story already. And when they first arrived, they moved into position at Bois, with their bear additions moving forward around the area of Vendries, which we can see already marked on the map there. And a deliberate structure was created on the 14th, 15th of September. They opened up advanced dressing stations at Moulon and Vendries, which are the 2 red circles top right of the map. And they set up a divisional collecting station at Villers with No. 2's Field Ambulance's tented division, and that's down the bottom there. The casualties continued flooding in, and the bear divisions collected wounded into caves and trod on to shelter them before they could then evacuate them further back. But these routes were under constant shelling, and one attempt to move the wounded by convoy on the 15th of September was hit. A high explosive shell killed 2 RAMC men and 1 patient, and the horses from the ambulances stampeded. However, despite these challenges, they still managed to get several wagons through, and about 100 walking wounded still made it through to Villers under fire. Now, one of the officers from the field ambulances of this division, Lieutenant Colonel Hinge from No. 1 Field Ambulance, kept a diary, and I'm not going to quote it directly, but it shows us a lot of detail, some of the challenges they faced. He talks about night marches in darkness and rain, no lights and shells overhead, and finding bivouac spots just off the road wherever they could. He talked about setting up dressing stations in churches and barns, but still being constantly threatened by shelling. He said they start to run out of rations for the patients, and whilst there was enough for the RAMC men, they ended up trying to make improvised stews from whatever they could find and using these RAMC men's rations. Wounded were arriving with their wounds already septic, because some of them had actually laid out for a day or more before they were evacuated. And the hard reality was that evacuation had to be done at night because the roads were untenable by day. Horses and wagons were becoming exhausted from continuous convoys between the caves up at the front, that's like Moulins and Vendries, and Villers down the bottom there. And to give you an example, the routine seemed to fall into, or they fell into, was that the wagons left Villers at dusk, about 7:30 p.m. They worked forward through shell-threatened roads and returned in the early hours with casualties. By late September, the routine had really set in, and the field ambulance kept with that until they were pulled out of the area and sent up to Flanders, which is where we will follow them shortly. So moving a bit further across to the west, we're now going to see the 2nd Division, and they established its main dressing stations on the south bank at a place called Hospital Farm, and created advanced dressing stations in Chivy, Beuven, and Moussy. And they also used chateau sites at Soupir, which we've already seen, and Verneuil. Now, because the Hospital Farm position was too exposed, it was withdrawn to Villa d'Arcy. Oh, sorry, there's the chateau, and we can see that it's from 1917, so we can see some of the damage that had occurred. But because this whole area was being shelled so badly, the dressing station was pulled back to this position here. And a major of the RAMC, or a major loss to the RAMC at this point, was Colonel Dalton, and he was the newly appointed Assistant Director of Medical Services, basically the boss of the medics, and he was selecting a new dressing station, or trying to, at the Verneuil site on the 14th of September when he was hit by shell fire. He survived to the 18th of September but died of his wounds, and obviously that having the sort of top manager taken out would be a severe blow to the units. He was replaced by Colonel Holt, and this was the position that this division was to hold until they were pulled out in mid-October and sent up to Flanders. Again, we will follow them there. Continuing our westward move, we now come to the 3rd Division, and they centred themselves around a place called Braine, and its access roads toward the river and to a place called Chasmy were under direct enemy observation and continuously shelled. Forward attempts to place dressing stations too near the river could be punished immediately, and they tried to set up a dressing station at Chasmy, but suffered severe shelling on the 14th of September with both RAMC and Army Service Corps casualties. This forced them to withdraw back to a sugar factory site near Braine, which is marked down the bottom there. Now, the official history of the medical services talks about Valais and says it might be the most dangerous mile in the system. An advanced dressing station was established here, and initially that was in churches and houses, but it was later moved to a doctor's house and school, and this was because it was repeatedly shelled, including the church being shelled. Evacuation from Valais became a drill built around artillery timing. Stretcher bearers would carry a patient about a mile down to the bridge, and then they would cross the bridge at the double, often starting immediately after a shell burst in the hope that they would pass in a gap before the next one arrived. Ambulance wagons, and this did include motor vehicles, waited in sheltered roads on the southern side of the river, and then they would call forward, pick up the casualties and withdraw. And again, like the official histories and a number of the other sources that I've looked at point out there was some hard-earned lessons in this, and that was to don't keep all the ambulance wagons waiting to load together, spread them out into different sites and kind of call them forward when you need them, and as soon as you've got a wagon loaded, get rid of it and send it off. So Braine became a major evacuation hub, and when clearing hospitals arrived, field ambulances were displaced and had to adapt by forming station parties and satellite dressing stations. Again, this covered us through to mid-October when the 3rd Division also moved off to Flanders. So coming across to the western side of the British front line, see just up by the town of Soissons, we're now looking at the 5th Division. And their basic plan was to set up dressing stations at Searches, Jury, and Mont de Soissons Farm. And the intention was that Searches would serve as a divisional collecting station, and everything would be evacuated from there by motor lorries. However, the reality was that lorries rendezvoused near Mont de Searches, and the Searches approach was too steep. Mont de Soissons. So Searches and Jury were taken out of the system, and it was only Mont de Soissons that was being used because the vehicles couldn't get further forward, and that happened on the 15th of September. Now, there were attempts to run forward for advanced dressing stations in places such as Missy, but this was restricted by constant shelling of roads and bridges. So, for example, a section crossed to Missy with 6 wagons on the 14th and 15th of September and were pinned down by shell fire, only getting back on the 16th of September with their wounded. Now, a chaplain volunteered to go forward with them, showing how mixed and improvised these teams could be. And again, they were there till very early in October when they were pulled out and sent up to Flanders. So now we move on to the 4th Division, and they were on the very left, and they had an advanced dressing station at Boucau-sur-Loing. Also another one in St Margaret, which is a little place not marked on the map, and then also one in Venzoul, which is where the bridge is to cross the river. But this bridge was so difficult because wagons were often massed and only a few manhandled across. And because the whole valley was being searched by enemy shells, the main collecting station moved, and it was moved back to Carré-l'Écon Farm. And this was because it was an extensive series of caves that had been quarried over time and provided excellent shelter. Now, something else that was quite important that happened here, number 6 Clearing Hospital, which was originally intended purely as reinforcement personnel, was then ordered to take over a French auxiliary hospital in the chateau at Rosières. You can see that just down at the very bottom corner of the map. And whilst it took over what was meant to be a hospital, in practice it just acted like a high-capacity main dressing station, feeding casualties further back to railheads and improper clearing hospitals further behind. Now, I'd suggest this shows the British medical system adapting in real time to the Aisne's needs. Now, leadership structures start to catch up, and the 19th Field Ambulance, which was with 19th Brigade, suffered heavy shelling near Vezenil and repeatedly had to shelter men and horses by day, moving only after dark, again reinforcing the night economy of casualty work. Now, early in the AIM fighting, Corps medical leadership was incomplete. The 1st and 3rd Corps initially lacked a Deputy Director of Medical Services, and these roles were only filled mid-month, so 16th, 19th September, around there, as part of the gradual shift from improvised crisis response to a more managed system. And the reason this is important is that the field ambulances generally functioned as a divisional asset rather than a brigade level asset, so not having the managerial people in meant it wouldn't work very well. And when I did my masters, my dissertation was about the Royal Army Medical Corps field ambulances at the Battle of Arras, so when we get to that it's going to be quite a deep dive. But all the information about where they were setting up, when they were moving, was always coming from the divisional level, not anywhere else. So what can we learn from all of this? The big takeaway? Well, the AIM forces the modern evacuation system into being. The AIM battle showed the medical services moving from crisis improvisation into a more organised chain. So near the trenches, advanced dressing stations, main dressing stations on the south bank, motor lorries to the railhead but under a unique constraint. The River Aisne and shell bridges made the evacuation gap the central problem. And in that problem we see the beginnings of something new. Motor ambulance cars were being used for the first time in the front areas, and there was a growing recognition that medical services needed dedicated evacuation transport, not just borrowing space on supply lorries. So in short, the AIM didn't just produce casualties, it forced the British Army to redesign how it moved the wounded. And I hope you are finding these useful. If you do, please do all the obvious YouTube stuff, like, comment and subscribe. And the next episode, which should be out in a couple of weeks' time, is going to be on the fighting at Ypres. We could call it First Ypres.